Finding One's Way with Clay by Paulus Berensohn. Chapter 1. An Approach to Working. Finding My Work. Of all the hand-forming pottery techniques, pinch pots are most often given the least emphasis, despite the fact that they are generally the first method we are taught or teach. It is difficult to make a controlled form by this method. The pots look crude, they crack in our hands and collapse. They are often heavy, difficult to glaze, and frustrating. As a student, I avoided attempting to pinch. As a teacher, I found myself again and again unable to find a more appropriate substitute as an introduction to hand building. It seemed a good idea to pinch first, because it offered me the most direct contact with the clay that I knew. By pinching, you could see and experience the texture of the clay, feel the clay as it thinned with the pressure of your fingers, and be witness to the clay's moisture drying with its exposure to air and the blotting action of your fingers. With all these good thoughts, I was still unable to find my own way into pinching or to illuminate the act for my students. I would show them photographs of early Japanese pinched raku tea bowls and pass around a delicate leaf-like pinched bowl made by my teacher, Mary Caroline Richards. To handle this pot was like taking hold of her hand. It helped. In my desire to encourage pinching by my students, I began more and more to return to attempting making bowls in this way. It was, finally, a literary image that quickened my interest and brought this way of making pots alive for me personally, and in turn for my students, as my ardor became apparent. In one of his books, Jean Genet, the French playwright and novelist, speaks of his desire to roam the countryside with a begging bowl, a bowl, as I read it, in which to receive what he needed for the nourishment of his life, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Reading this, I had an immediate response, a recognition of this image's importance to my own life, my own need. I set about to make my first begging bowls. I found that I could not make them on the potter's wheel, that the precision and symmetry, in this case, worked against the direct feeling I was pursuing. I made some bowls by coiling and by slab, but it was not until I had pinched them out of one bowl of clay each that I began to feel connected in what I was doing and what I was feeling. All of a sudden, I had a need to pinch, and found that pinching began to open the door into a totally new experience of clay, one based firmly in where I was in my own experience of myself. I pinched thin, hollow, simple shells, giving them the time they seemed to require to take their form. After experimentation, I glazed them quietly with smooth skins on the inside, allowing the clay to stand clean on the outside. I have continued pinching with growing enthusiasm ever since. Starting with these small individual begging bowls, I progressed as my skill increased and my feelings and needs necessitated to related sets of beloved bowls. Large individual story pots, avocado planters, plates, bowls, pinched globes, etc., because I found, in most cases, that glaze was too heavy and rich in addition to the outer surface of these bowls. I moved intuitively to a concern about the color of the clay itself, and soon began using two or more clay bodies wedged together to enhance the earth-connected mood. My excitement about the flexibility this gave me sent me further into an exploration of the various additives I could use to alter the color of my clays. I discovered a whole palette of color was possible in the clay itself, and began firing my pots at temperatures varying from cone 012 to cone 9 in oxidization atmospheres, as well as cone 10 in reduction fire. I use these clays wedged together, inlaid or appliqued to the forms, to add color and texture and design, symbols of connection, signs of source. Just having this color to use from the very beginning of the forming of a pot has brought a new aliveness and a new dimension to the work. Making pinched forms has been important in my recent life as a potter for one reason especially. My work on the wheel and in coiling, slabbing, and teaching had been largely marked by productivity, high spirits, rapid rhythms, and often almost breathless excitement and ambition. The more I pinched, however, the slower I seemed to move. My breath deepened, and my very posture as I worked seemed to become less tense. I discovered soon that pinching offered me an alternative to my usual rhythm of work and an enrichment of it. My pinch pots asked to be formed slowly, quietly, and with deep attention. New respect and interest has grown in me for the touch and the color of clay, for its perishability and its strength. I am taking more care in my selection and making of clay bodies, allowing them in their own time to age. This lesson, that time is needed for both clay and potter to ripen, is a nourishing and supportive one. The simple act of pinching small bowls is for me healing and centering. These quietly and slowly pinched bowls form the core of my work, to which I return again and again for a deep breath, as if in meditation and prayer. First steps towards freedom. It has been my experience that students of pottery are sooner able to recognize the need for a disciplined program of study on the potter's wheel than they are in hand forming, and perhaps it is because of this very difficulty in gaining precision on the wheel that we often seek what seems to us the greater freedom of expression possible in working without the wheel. Yet I have noticed that in most cases, working with this particular sense of freedom in hand building often leads to predictable ends. Frustration at not being able to make the materials do what we want them to do. A sameness from piece to piece due to the lack of technical skill and exploration that can extend the range of possibility. And pieces that often attempt too much and result in a piece containing enough form, texture, content, and glaze to enrich a host of pieces. It is because of this that I urge my students, even those with a vast previous experience, to start at the beginning, if they can, and lead them through a few relatively simple and clear exercises designed to show them how to control and at the same time work along with the clay, pinching open and closed forms, large and small forms, clean and textured forms, thick and thin, symmetrical and asymmetrical, so that our freedom is equipped with power and range for expression. At the same time, and this is central to the whole point of this book, these exercises do not come out of a purely technical concern. They are concerned acutely with the growing relationship of the potter to his clay, with bringing more and more personality, imagination, and inspiration into play, and with tapping sources deep within the experience of the potter to inform the forms he makes. In the deepest sense, this is what I believe technique is. The ability to breathe the spirit of our lives into what we make. I don't believe it to be a talent that we either have or don't have. We all breathe. We all are alive. We all have unique qualities. Yet it takes hard conscious and unconscious work for most of us to connect these facts with what we make, to find our pot, as we also seek our dance and our song. And so I am concerned here with the questions of how do we work, how do we exercise, so that our bodies and the clay bodies come together strengthened and more articulate. The freedom I seek is not one that lets me do what I want to do, but rather a freedom that equips me to be able to do what I need to do. This first exercise that follows is clearly that, an exercise. It is important to remember that it is not a pot you are making, but an exercise you are performing. It's very helpful if you can engage in this exercise with as little prejudgment as possible. Don't decide if you like the exercise or don't before you do it. Try to witness what you make without declaring it good or bad, ugly or beautiful. Such declarations seem like very heavy burdens for such young work to bear. In a very real sense, in this work, failure, if there is such a thing, can be viewed as a privilege. To make something successfully on the first try leaves you, in some cases, with little but a souvenir, whereas getting lost may afford you the opportunity to stop, re-examine, and begin again and again, with renewed insight, and perhaps even personally developed solutions to move you on with strength. These are first steps, and like those of a young child, they may be uncoordinated, uncertain, and you may fall down, but they may also be enlivened by discoveries of your own, and a sense of joy in a new ability opening up. Preparing. When I return to pinching, after having worked on other things, or when I have been away from my studio, I start again at the beginning, with a ball of clay about the size of a small orange. The clay and its consistency is of importance to me. I like the clay to be slightly on the wet side, unless it is extremely plastic and relatively grog-free, in which case a stiffer consistency will work well. Different clay bodies have different characteristics for pinching. Some bodies will pinch till they almost disappear in thinness. Others will insist upon thicker walls. In most cases, fresh-made clays tend to crack on the edges and on the outside of the walls. This can be very beautiful if you choose to go along and leave the cracks. If you make your own clay body, it is very helpful to be ahead of yourself and wedge the fresh clay and allow it to age, stored away for at least a couple of months. Or you can add a bit of vinegar or some fresh urine to your clay when you are preparing it to help along the aging process. If you throw on the wheel, save the throwing slops in your water bucket, for this tends to be especially fine clay for pinching. Or use reconstituted, recycled clay. The ways of actually making clay vary as well. Nowadays, there are several clay mixes on the market which studio potters working alone or in small groups or schools can afford. My own feeling about clay mixes is that they are fine if one works on the wheel and needs large amounts of clay, especially when one can take advantage of them to prepare and properly age sufficient clay ahead of time. Mixers have been especially helpful to schools in solving the problem of needing large amounts of clay with limited space for storing it. The basic principle of these mixes is that just enough water is added to the clay to make it workable. I prefer, when I have the choice, clays that are prepared by adding the clay mix to the water. Because I usually work alone and do not have to supply great amounts of clay, when I make my own clay, I prefer the old garbage pail method. I dry mix my clay formula in a large wooden box, or a cardboard drum, thoroughly mixing the various ingredients with a hoe or rake, or by covering and rolling the drum. Then I scoop the dry clay into the plastic garbage pails filled about 1/3 with water. I keep scooping till the level of the water reaches the top of the pail. This way, each molecule of clay has the opportunity to drink up as much moisture as it needs till it is saturated. This tends to make for slippery molecules and earlier plasticity. I siphon off the excess water and dry the clay to workable consistency on large plaster bats. Bruce and Lisa Green, potters at the Island of the Red Hood in West Virginia, shared with me their solution to limited space for clay preparation. They first dry mix their clay body formula and soak half of it in water, allowing it to age. When they are ready for clay, they use the remaining dry mix to stiffen up the liquid clay by wedging it together on the floor with their feet. This method eliminates the need for large plaster drying bats and assures you of at least some added plasticity from the soaked clay. If you have your clay body made, or purchase a body commercially, you can try dealing with a company that filter presses its clay. Rather than adding just the right amount of water to the dry clay in a large mixer, the more common method used these days, even by some large clay supply companies, in the filter pressing process, the clay is first prepared in a wet slip state and then squeezed between sheets of canvas under pressure to workable dampness. These clays are usually excellent for pinching. And yet, almost every clay, no matter how it's made, will work for pinching to some extent. It may take a little experimentation on your part until you find a clay that has a feel that you will enjoy pinching. Try out the clay bodies you have in your studio or at the school or class that you attend. When visiting potter friends, ask for a 1-pound sample ball of the clay they use. If you live near a clay supplier, it might be worthwhile to visit them or have them send you 5-pound samples of the clays they make. I pinch with a variety of clays, but the body I have been using most often is an especially plastic one, the formula of which I first used at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts when I was a beginning student. The body was developed by Karen Carnes, Mary Caroline Richards, and David Weinrib when they shared a studio in Stony Point, New York, some years ago. Its firing range is cone 8 to cone 12. It is a pleasing light grey to tan in reduction, and is an off-yellow-white in oxidation. For more color, you can simply add from 2 to 8 or more % of Ohio red or Dalton clay, or Valentine clay, Barnard clay, or black iron oxide, or any number of other iron-rich clays. Stony Point Stoneware Body. Jordan Clay, 50. AP Green Missouri Plastic Fire Clay, 50. Ball Clay, Tennessee No. 5, 25. Flint Silica, 13. A3 Kona Feldspar, 8.5. Grog, Calamo 100, 3. When I can afford to do so, I store away some of this clay in an unheated room in my barn. After 2 years of freezing and defrosting, this clay becomes what I like to call vintage clay. It seems to throw and pinch with a vigor all its own, a true collaborator. I find taking this time in the preparation of my clay deeply satisfying. It is, however, not necessary. After I wedge the clay, I try not to begin working immediately, but rather to let the activity of wedging quiet in me for at least a few moments before making the initial opening in the ball of clay. I find a chair in which I can sit with a straight but relaxed back. Holding the clay in both hands, I often close my eyes or lower my focus and concentrate on the feeling of the clay in my hands, how cold it is, how wet, how it feels now at this moment. I try to be aware of my breathing without forcing to let it lower deep into my belly. Many potters literally do not breathe when working, especially when throwing on the wheel. I had a problem with this and have to constantly return to an awareness of my breath. When I feel together and with the clay, so to speak, I then start opening the solid sphere. Important basic principle. If you take a small ball of clay with about the diameter of a quarter and press pinch hard into its center, chances are that the edges will crack. If, however, you rotate the ball and press firmly but gently in small pinches all over its surface, while offering counter-pressure with the fingers of the other hand on its edge, you will more likely be able to pinch this ball thin without its cracking. In pinching, as in throwing on the wheel, the clay needs our support, a firm and tender touch, a pressing out by one hand or fingers, not into a void, but into the supportive, giving, and even resisting capacities of the other hand or fingers. Exercise 1. Making a small, symmetrical, thin-walled pinch pot. Number 1. Opening. Hold a small ball of clay in your left palm. Rotate the ball slowly as you press slowly into the center of the ball with your right thumb. Start with the lower joint of your thumb bent forward horizontally. As you go deeper into the heart of the clay, straighten your thumb out and down into a vertical position. Keep going until you are almost 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of the ball. All we are trying to accomplish here is making the opening. Try not to make the opening wider than the size of your thumb. If you combine the act of opening with the act of widening, you will more easily lose control. To hold to symmetry, be sure to have a rhythmic relationship between your pressing thumb and the rotating ball. If you do not rotate, the shape of the thumb will immediately set up variations in the thickness of the clay around your opening. Just how much clay you leave at the bottom of the ball will affect the final shape of your pot. Leave 1/4 inch of clay this time, and experiment with more or less in future practice. 2. Spreading the floor and setting up the walls. Using the right thumb on the inside of the pot and the 2 middle fingers of the same hand on the outside of the pot, slowly spread the bottom wider by lightly pressing your thumb towards your 2 middle fingers. Press and rotate the pot. After each press pinch of the thumb, rotate the clay about 1/4 of an inch with the other hand. Go all the way around at least once, using the same pressure for each pinch and the same degree of rotation. I generally perform this act with the pot upside down on my thumb. After spreading the bottom, I move up, or down if working upside down, the wall and repeat this gesture of press pinching in the middle of the pot and then move to just below the rim, taking care that I press lightly enough and supportively enough that the rim does not crack open. If it does crack, I smooth over the top of the rim with a thumb of one hand while supporting the pot in my other hand. Leave a little extra clay at the rim. This will allow for greater flexibility when, in later steps, you come to shape the piece. When working for symmetry, or near symmetry, it is important to understand that once you pinch the pot in one place, it is necessary to repeat this pinch for at least one complete revolution of the pot in your hand, or you will begin to develop an unevenness in the walls. In other words, once you make a gesture upon the clay, you are committed to repeating that gesture all the way around the ball of clay, if it is symmetry you are working for. When working on step 2, it is possible to exert some control of the eventual shape of the finished pot by the pressure of the 2 outside fingers. Should you want the pot to result in a bowled out form, do not resist the pressure of the thumb with the 2 outside fingers. Bowling out will happen naturally, as the thumb tends to be stronger. For a higher, rounder bowl, the pressure of the thumb and the 2 middle fingers can be more equal. For a more lifted, more cylindrical form, the pressure of the outside fingers becomes stronger than the thumb, as well as moving slightly up the wall as you press, or down if working upside down. A cylindrical shape is the most difficult one to make, and from what I know now, this last step is most important in aiming for a cylinder. 2 other helpful suggestions. 1. Start with a ball of clay that is longer than it is wide, and open it at one of the ends. 2. Shift from an equal pressure between the thumb and the outside fingers to a slight sliding motion that has the thumb moving slightly down into the pot, while the outside fingers slide up, bringing a bit of clay up with them. For really tall cylinders, it appears to be helpful, while performing this step, to hold the pot sideways in your hand. Then, as you press the clay, the holding hand gently squeezes. This encourages the clay you are shaping to move up toward the rim rather than out. 3. Ribbing the inside. The front of the thumb is an excellent tool. When the thumb is bent as far back as it can go, it resembles the curved wood, metal, or rubber ribs that some potters use in shaping bowl forms on the wheel. Place your right thumb, bent back as far as possible, as near the center of the bottom of the pot as you can reach. Use the 2 middle fingers of the same hand and the fingers of your left hand to rotate the pot. Slowly describe a long spiral to the rim. The thumb slides, supported by the middle fingers, which lift to rotate and to press gently to support the clay that is being described and stretched by the thumb. I find this a helpful technique for making a symmetrical form. While the continually and slowly spiraling thumb rounds out the inside, it also checks and evens out the walls as well as thinning them very slightly. This is especially an important step for pots with a round, bowled-out feeling. Up until this point, I usually work with the pot in my hands. If the clay is fairly stiff, I can go on with the pot still held this way. When the clay is softer, however, I will put the pot down before or after going on to steps 4 and 5. I always place a small piece of paper between the pot and the table, bat, or turntable, so that the pot does not stick. It is not necessary to have a bat or a turntable, as a small piece of paper, cardboard, or paper toweling works very well and rotates freely with a slight movement of the fingers. If you do not use paper between the clay and the table you work on, the wet clay may stick and pull the pot off center. Also, it is often the case that the table or bat may dry out the clay at the foot area too rapidly. 4. Reinforcing the rim. After step 3, the rim may possibly open in cracks, but even if it does not, it is helpful to reinforce the rim. Much as in throwing, where the potter tends to press down on the rim after each pull up the wall of the cylinder, in pinching too, the pressure of the fingers on either side of the rim, without counterpressure on top, is likely to leave the rim weak. Press smooth down on the top of the rim with your thumb, while supporting both sides with the fingers of your other hand. 5. Stroking. Starting in the center of the floor, or at the place where the floor flows into the wall, or as far down as you are able to reach, press and stretch, a smoothing motion, with a thumb up the wall against the outside fingers. The thumb starts vertically and continues till it is bent back at the knuckle in an almost 45-degree angle. This gesture should move you 1/3, 1/2, or 2/3 up the wall, depending on the size of the pot. Stroke and rotate, until you have gone all the way around at least once. Repeat this same motion again, this time starting just below that place on the wall where you finished your first rotations. If you do not reach the rim with this rotation, repeat the stroking, starting where your second stroking rotation ended. End just under the rim, rather than continuing past it. 6. Working the rim again. Step 5 tends to bow out the form so that it is wider at the middle than it may be at the bottom or at the rim. If you want to keep this shape, reinforce, thin, and smooth. Rotate the rim by pressing with the outside fingers down onto the thumb. The thumb cooperates by pointing to the direction you want the clay to move toward. Should you want the form to be open or straight at the rim, rotate with the thumb on the outside of the pot, supported now by the 2 middle fingers on the inside. The shape will very much depend on how much clay there is at the rim. If there is less clay at the rim than at the middle of the walls, pinching the walls to an even thickness will result in a shape that closes in. For a straight-sided wall, there should be a little extra clay at the rim that can be pinched out to make a straight profile. For a form that opens out at the top, more clay must be left at the rim, so that when the walls are then pinched even, the form will open out. Note that whenever a crack appears at the rim, you can close it by stroking or pinching or by bringing up a little softer clay from just under the rim to act as a sealer. It should not be necessary to use water if you act to close these cracks soon enough. It has been my experience that using water weakens the pot, but that a supportive caressing, pinching, and stroking will actually seem to release moisture from the clay itself. However, some people have skin that seems to act as a blotter, drinking up the moisture. In such cases, it can be helpful to have a bowl of water nearby to wash any dry clay off the fingertips, leaving them slightly moist. If the cracks at the rim prove especially difficult to heal, you could place the pot upside down on a damp cloth for a few minutes. This will soften the rim enough to press smooth the cracks closed. If you wait to close cracks at the rim, the thin edges of the cracks may air dry and be difficult to heal, or they may seem to heal only to open in the bisque or glaze fire. Surface cracking on the side walls of the pot does not weaken it as long as the inside is smooth. You can either leave these patterned cracks or smooth them over gently with your thumb, trying not to lose the symmetry of your form. If the cracks are fine enough, they can be scraped or sanded later. There is, of course, no law about the rim of a pinched pot. Often the rim will crack in such a rhythmical and naturally patterned way that you may decide to leave it as it is. Important note: as your pot is now on the table and the clay plastic and moist, the bottom will tend to flatten out. You will be unable, also, to thin out the clay at the bottom of the walls and at the floor without the pot collapsing further. Don't worry about that at this point. Continue working the top 2/3 of the pot until finished, leaving the floor and lower walls as they are. This particular approach to pinching is based on the finishing of the top 2/3 to 1/2 of the pot, while leaving the floor and lower wall to be completed later. 7. Thinning. At this point, the pot should be approaching an evenness and a roundness. To thin the walls, further repeat step 2, pinching with the thumb, and/or step 5, stroking, or use any pinching gesture that feels comfortable or seems appropriate, as long as you repeat such a gesture all the way around the pot so as to maintain the symmetry and evenness. You may at this point find it helpful to reverse the pinching gesture of step 2, that is, using your thumb on the outside of the pot with your 2 middle fingers on the inside. If you use small, consistent, and shallow pinches, especially on the top 1/3 of the pot, you may be able to even out the unevenness and bring the pot to a more toward round. There is no special virtue in thin-walled pinch pots, but for the sake of this exercise, it would be important to experience pinching the clay as thin as you and the clay are able. To an 1/8 of an inch thick wall, or 1/16th or 32nd of an inch, paper thin, how far can you go before the clay disappears? If we are able to pinch thin and even, then we can stop, by choice, at any point of thickness we feel to be right for the forms we will pinch in the future. 2 important principles for small, round pinch pots. 1. Pinch with 1 thumb at a time. However, at some time you might try using both thumbs with a larger amount of clay and see if you can keep them moving either together for symmetry or in separate rhythms for asymmetry. 2. Move slowly, steadily, and rhythmically. Try not to jump from one place to another. Once you make a gesture with a pinch on the wall, you commit yourself to repeat the gesture all the way around, if you practice this exercise. Don't rush. Take it slowly. Most people experience difficulty with pinching when they work too fast and when they work unrhythmically. It's helpful to work in a rhythm related to one's breathing. 8. Finishing the rim. Even when you have the ability to make a perfectly symmetrical form, there is often a waviness at the rim. In most cases, I prefer to leave this slight and natural flow. On occasion, however, one side may be higher than the other, or part of the edge lower than the rest, and I may decide to alter it so that it will be even and level. In the case of making a pinch balloon, see page 50, it may be essential to trim the edge. I learned an especially useful method of trimming edges from the late extraordinary French potter Francine Delpierre that I like to use. Find the lowest point of the uneven rim. Hold a pair of small and sharp scissors in your hand, keeping the elbow of your working arm at exactly the same horizontal level as the scissors. Rotating the pot, the paper, or the turntable, begin to trim the rim by cutting in a steady rhythm. Keep checking that your elbow is remaining where it began and has not fallen or risen. You can practice by resting your elbow on a pile of books while trimming. If your elbow has remained steady, you should end up where you started cutting. Now you can leave smooth the cut edge with your thumb and supporting finger, or leave the cut marks if it feels as though it's in the spirit of what you have made. There is another reason why I may trim the edge. On occasion, especially when I may be working from a specific source, the pots may become complicated in their form. Trimming the edge has the effect of pulling the piece together, so to speak. The less complicated trimmed edge can serve a function similar to a frame on a painting, that of focusing the attention. 9. Thinning the bottom. When you have reached the desired shape and thinness in the top 2/3 to 3/4 of the pot, and have completed the edge, it is necessary to wait before thinning the bottom to the thickness or thinness of the rest of the pot, especially if the pot is thin and moist. If you were to lift the pot now and pinch the bottom, the form would distort and the bottom flatten when you set it down again. What I do to avoid this is to wrap the bottom and lower wall of the pot with some light plastic, the kind used to cover dry cleaning, and also to place a piece of plastic inside the pot on its floor. In a few hours, depending on the drying conditions of where you work, when the rim and top are almost leather hard, or at that point where the form will not distort when lifted, I unwrap the pot and hold it in one hand. I then use the thumb or middle finger of the other hand to stretch out the wet clay, which has remained moist because it's been well wrapped in plastic from the inside. Depending on how much clay is left, the lower sides will widen and the bottom will drop. The inside thumb or finger that is stretching can feel the other hand through the clay, so that one can feel and control the thickness. The holding hand also acts to support the pressure coming from the inside, checking that it does not press out too far. You can either start at that point on the wall where the clay is moist and work down, or start at the floor and work up. The former will lengthen your pot, the latter will widen it. Instead of a flat bottom, there will now be a bowl round curve. To avoid the wet bottom flattening again when I set it down, I dry the pot on its rim. When the bottom has stiffened enough to hold the weight of the pot, I either add a raised foot, or usually I turn it over and tap it lightly on the table so as to form a small flat area on which the bowl can sit unwobbling. It is possible, in this way, to change the shape of a bowl with a wide flat floor and only an inch or two of wall into a much higher form. It would depend on how much extra thickness of clay there was in the floor. Almost no extra clay would still round out, lifting the shape. 1/2 inch of clay could raise the pot several inches. This step of wrapping the lower part of the pot is, I believe, what makes it possible to 1. Make thin forms, and 2. Make pinch pots using more than the amount of clay you can hold in the palm of your hand. Sometimes this step is not necessary, especially when you are leaving walls of more substantial thickness. In such cases, finish the pot in your hands, and so as to not lose this bottom curve, rest the pot on its rim until the pot is stiff enough to hold its shape right side up. Lift the pot in both hands and close your eyes. The feel of it is very important. How does it feel? In the name of this exercise in evenness and symmetry, it should feel of a piece, so to speak. Where is the center of its gravity? Does it feel bottom or top heavy? Open your eyes and look inside. The inside shape should be uncomplicated, one smooth curve holding air. Imagine what the inside would look like if the air could be frozen and removed. Does the outside shape relate to the inside shape? 10. Finishing the outside. The finished pot will show your finger marks. Because they are your fingers, the pot will have a unique texture, and you will probably want the marks to remain. There may be a network of fine or strong cracks on the surface caused by the strong pressure of the thumb pressing the clay out from the inside. This texture, too, you may find pleasing and natural and earth-like the shell of some nuts. Should you want the outer walls of the pot clean and uncomplicated, you can scrape off the finger marks and texture with a flexible spring steel scraping tool when the pot is at the leather hard stage or just past it. If the clay has heavy grog, the scraping will pull at the grog and make an even but scratchy surface. You can either leave this or use sandpaper when the pot is totally dry to smooth it over. You can add texture by using very coarse sandpaper that will scratch many small lines, like cross-hatching on the surface. After bisquing, you can glaze the outside or just the inside, leaving the outside to show the clay and the texture. You can use engobes or slips and paint on the walls of the pot as if it were a canvas waiting for an image or a brushstroke. You could write a letter on the surface, or tell a picture story, or make designs. Or you could rub thin slips or oxides with water into the walls to darken the surface color or highlight the texture. The steps of this exercise are merely suggestions for achieving a thin symmetrical form, a point of departure. Try the exercise a few times to see if you can achieve this goal of simplicity, roundness, and evenness. Along the way, you may find a more suitable or comfortable way of handling the clay and achieving this same goal. Keep watching and feeling what's happening, what your fingers are doing, what your clay does. If you can, practice until you are able to make a simple round bowl as described. Then you may find that you like the look or feel of your hands on the clay, and may want to exaggerate the marks your fingers leave by deepening your pinch bite on the clay. Or you may want to open the clay purposefully off-center and see where the clay's unevenness leads you. Or you may want to make thick-walled but even pots, or thick and uneven pots, textured by carving or by pinching out spines. Or the shape may be determined by your mood, or a story you wish to tell, or a fantasy you once had. Or the shape can be the result of what the pot is to be used for, or for whom it is being made, or why. It may show the anger you have been feeling, or the tenderness, or the sensuality, or the anxiety, or the quietness, or all of these. You have more freedom to show what you feel, or want to now, that you have gained some strength in practice. To work off-center, it is important to know where center is. I feel richer in my asymmetry because of my knowledge of symmetry, not a victim of the clay's will, but a participant. Practice this first exercise many times. Even after you feel you have mastered it, return to it again and again, like a pianist returning to his scales. Notice the shapes that your touch on the clay seems to produce, and see whether you can add other shapes by altering your touch and leaving sometimes more, sometimes less clay at the floor or at the edge of the piece, so as to be able to exercise control over the shapes that you achieve.